Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. American consumers are hungry for more mobile connectivity. The innovation economy is being driven by mobility, and spectrum is what fuels those wireless services. We must make it a priority to increase the availability of spectrum for commercial use, both licensed and unlicensed, as quickly as possible. Last week, as the Chairman prior mentioned, FCC Chairman Wheeler announced that the agency's timeline for the broadcast incentive auction has slipped from 2014 to mid-2015. It's important for the auction to be completed as soon as possible, but one lesson from the disastrous rollout of healthcare.gov is that a short delay of this complicated effort may be justified. Consumers will benefit from a speedy reallocation of spectrum for more valuable uses, but those households that continue to receive over-the-air TV broadcasts after the auctions must not be unduly disrupted during the channel repacking process. Congress was clear about this in the Spectrum Act of 2012, and the technical details to make this work deserve an appropriate amount of time and deliberation. As we all know, the mobile market is no longer focused on voice calls alone. It is increasingly about robust broadband Internet connectivity. During the committee's recent broadband adoption hearing, we learned that 1 in 8 online Americans now access the Internet solely through their mobile smartphones rather than subscribing to a fixed broadband service. With that in mind, I hope our witnesses will share their thoughts about what spectrum policies will make it more likely for wireless to develop as a substitute for and a competitor to wireline broadband. Getting more spectrum into the marketplace for broadband via auction to the parties that will put it to the highest use is ultimately the best way for federal policymakers to encourage new services, spur competition, and benefit consumers. In the incentive auction, I believe the FCC should let all interested participants freely compete against one another in the open market and should avoid putting its thumb on the scale, as we are apparently witnessing in connection with the Justice Department settlement agreement in the American Airlines and U.S. Airways merger. The value of using spectrum auctions is that the free market is more effective at allocating spectrum than relying on the subjective opinions and predictions of government officials. American consumers should pick who wins in the marketplace, not the government. And with the U.S. being the global leader in 4G LTE connectivity, this approach has clearly been very successful. By any measure, including usage, coverage, speed, and price, consumers have benefited enormously from market-driven spectrum auctions. As the Commission moves forward, its primary focus needs to be on how to maximize participation in the upcoming incentive auction among both broadcasters and wireline bidders, not on how to limit wireless bidders, not on how to limit their participation. I agree with our colleague, Senator Schumer, who recently urged the Commission to avoid imposing auction rules that could discourage broadcasters from participating, could limit bidding by certain wireless carriers, and could ultimately reduce the amount of spectrum offered as well as the revenue that would be generated in return. Mr. Chairman, I would ask for consent to submit for the record Senator Schumer's letter along with 2 additional documents that echo his and my concerns.
Without objection.
The first is an analysis by Dr. Leslie Marks, a professor at Duke University and a former chief economist at the FCC. And the second document is a letter from the FCC, to the FCC from Larry Cohen, the president of the Communication Workers of America. Instead of exploring auction rules to arbitrarily limit or benefit certain carriers, the FCC has the ability to consider setting a limit on the amount of spectrum any single bidder can win in the incentive auction. Such a limit applying equally to every bidder would at least allow all companies to have a fair shot at acquiring the spectrum they need while preventing any single entity from winning all the licenses. At a minimum, such a proposal should be explored as it seems to make sense and could result in an open and competitive auction. I hope our witnesses spend some time discussing this and other reasonable ways to find consensus on forward auction bidding. Another way to encourage more bidder activity and to benefit rural areas in particular is to auction licenses in a variety of geographic sizes. At a previous hearing, our committee heard that offering spectrum licenses covering smaller geographic areas can result in more bidders, more license winners, more revenue, and better service to rural areas. This approach appeared to work quite well in the 700 megahertz auction that occurred in 2008. I would like to hear our panelists' thoughts on how smaller license sizes have been used in the past, what the results have been, and how they could play a role in the broadcast incentive auction. Mr. Chairman, the FCC should not be distracted by proposals that could lead to less spectrum being made available and less auction proceeds being realized for national priorities like deficit reduction and FirstNet. Thanks again for holding today's hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists.
Thank you.
Dr. Singer, like you, I do not believe anyone should be restricted from bidding in the incentive auction. In your testimony, however, you suggest, and I quote, if regulators insist on going down the path of spectrum caps, that so-called symmetric spectrum caps, end quotes, would protect against the remote possibility that any single bidder acquired too much spectrum at the auction. Now, knowing that is not the ideal outcome for a truly market-based auction, can you explain why this idea may nonetheless provide a sort of middle ground resolution of the competing perspectives of some of the other witnesses today?
Sure. I've heard many arguments that's expressed a concern that one single bidder would gobble up all the spectrum in the auction. And if that's a concern, that can be addressed in less restrictive ways than the proposals that have been put out by T-Mobile and Sprint. I actually don't think that one bidder has a very good chance of gobbling up all of the spectrum in light of a good and fair competition. But if people are genuinely concerned about that contingency, a cap that hit all bidders equally, that is, that didn't treat bidders differently depending upon their coming into the auction spectrum, would mitigate that concern.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Berry, we both agree that smaller geographic spectrum licenses can attract more bidders to an auction and may increase revenue. And indeed, you specifically mentioned in your testimony that the 700 megahertz lower B block sold for much more than other blocks auctioned with larger license areas. It's my understanding, however, that AT&T and Verizon Wireless were both very active bidders for B block licenses. So my question is, could you explain why you expect their presence in future auctions will reduce revenue when their presence in the previous B block auction instead resulted in very high returns?
Well, there was a lot of interest in the B block and the lower band 12. Many of our members, as you know, the smaller carriers did come out and bid in very high ratios. If you look at the C block, which was the Verizon large aggregated REAG area, it didn't receive as much revenue as the lower block of spectrum. And I think what you see in that is with smaller geographic areas and the desire to bid, one of the larger carriers had already bought the C block. And as you know, the lower band 12 brought in over twice as much in terms of revenue per pop per meg. So I believe that this is unusual in the sense that this is the first opportunity for a greenfield 600 megahertz low band spectrum. It may be the last opportunity we have in over a decade. And if you small carriers are not, if they don't have access and if they don't have an opportunity to bid without being purchased out from under them by the largest carriers, then I think you're going to have a consolidation, further consolidation in the industry, because you will not be able to compete as a small carrier without getting to a 4G LTE. And remember, this spectrum is efficient in and of itself, especially in rural areas. One cell site, one tower can cover the distance of 4 or 5 towers in a higher spectrum band, and 2.5. And it's critical that our smaller carriers, and literally every carrier, has an opportunity to get access to this. You know, if you already own 80% of the low-band spectrum, which Verizon and AT&T do, it's a lot easier to be non-committal about how much spectrum the small carriers should, in fact, be able to bid on.
But do you think that, going back to the B block auction for just a moment, that the B block would have sold for more if AT&T and Verizon had not been bidding on those licenses?
No, I don't think it would have sold for more had AT&T not been bidding. But we're not suggesting that AT&T and Verizon not bid. Matter of fact, I want them to bid. I want them to bid in every market and every opportunity, because we get into the same ecosystem. We want handsets, we want devices, we want partners. We want partners that have the same bands in their devices so that we can roam and we can have partners to serve and our customers. So we want them to bid. I've never, ever said we didn't want AT&T and Verizon to bid. I just don't want them to be able to walk away with the entire pie, 1, 2, or 3 carriers.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. We have other colleagues here who want to ask questions, so thank you.
Thank you.